The inheritance letter arrived on a Tuesday. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the return address, Donovan and Associates, attorneys at law, my coffee growing cold beside me. It had been 6 months since my grandfather's passing, and while I'd attended the funeral, I'd been told there was nothing for me in the will. Not that I'd expected otherwise. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and expectations in my family had always been a one-way street. Yet here was a letter from his lawyers, addressed specifically to me. I slid my finger under the flap, careful not to tear the crisp envelope. The paper inside was thick, expensive, with an embossed letterhead that spoke of old money and older traditions. Dear Ms. Mitchell, as per the instructions of the late Harold James Mitchell, this letter serves as notification that certain conditions of his will have now been met. Your grandfather arranged for a trust to be released to you 6 months after his passing, conditional upon your brother, William Mitchell, not contesting the primary will. The sum of $3 million has been placed in a trust in your name. The letter slipped from my fingers, floating to the floor like a feather. $3 million? My grandfather, the same man who had barely acknowledged me at family gatherings, who had openly favored my older brother Will since childhood, had left me millions. It made no sense. My phone rang, startling me out of my shock. Will's name flashed on the screen. My stomach tightened instantly. Had he received a similar letter? Hello? I answered, trying to keep my voice neutral. Sarah. Will's tone was clipped, businesslike as always. Did you get a letter from grandfather's lawyers today? So he knew. Yes, just now. A pause. We need to talk. I'm coming over. Will I? The line went dead. Typical Will, assuming I would drop everything for him. And typically, I would. As the CEO of Mitchell Enterprises, my brother had inherited not just our grandfather's business acumen but his authoritative manner as well. The entire family operated on Will's schedule, his priorities. But today felt different. The letter had shifted something in me, like a foundation stone suddenly settling into a new position. I picked it up from the floor, rereading the words that had knocked the breath from my lungs. Conditional upon your brother, William Mitchell, not contesting the primary will. Why would my grandfather make my inheritance conditional on Will's behavior? And why keep it secret for 6 months? The doorbell rang, its chime echoing through my modest home. Will never wasted time. I opened the door to find my brother looking every inch the powerful executive, tailored suit, precision haircut, impatient stance. At 36, just 4 years my senior, Will had already transformed our grandfather's company into something bigger, more profitable, and according to some whispers, more ruthless. We need to discuss this inheritance situation, he announced, brushing past me into the house. No hello, no how are you, straight to business. I closed the door, my hand lingering on the knob. Hello to you too, Will. He turned, noticing my sarcasm but choosing to ignore it. Did your letter specify $3 million? Yes. Will's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That's impossible. It's what the letter says. Then there's been a mistake, he declared, pulling out his phone. I'll call Donovan right now. As he dialed, I watched him pace my living room, his presence making my comfortable home feel suddenly small and shabby. Will had always had that effect, diminishing anything that wasn't part of his carefully constructed world. Martin, it's William Mitchell. I'm calling about my sister's inheritance. He glanced at me. Yes, she received the letter. There must be some mistake. No, that can't be correct. I see. Fine, we'll be there tomorrow. 9 o'clock. He hung up, his expression darkening. Donovan says there's no mistake. The old man left you $3 million, kept in a separate trust none of us knew about. The way he said it, like I'd somehow tricked our grandfather, like I didn't deserve it, made something shift inside me. And that bothers you? I asked quietly. Will's laugh was sharp. Why would it bother me? I inherited the company, the main estate, the majority of his liquid assets. I'm just surprised. Grandfather always said you had no head for business. The familiar sting of those words I'd heard my entire life, hit its mark. I'd never been the business Mitchell. I was the dreamer, the one who'd chosen to teach English literature instead of getting an MBA. The disappointment. Well, apparently he felt I deserved something, I said, straightening my shoulders. Will's gaze softened slightly. Of course you did, Sarah. You were his granddaughter. I'm just trying to understand his reasoning. We'll find out tomorrow, I guess. Yes. He checked his watch. I'll pick you up at 8:30. Don't be late. As he headed for the door, he paused. Have you told Mom yet? I shook my head. Our mother, forever caught between her two children, would have a complicated reaction to this news. Let's wait until after we meet with Donovan, Will suggested. No need to upset her if there's been some administrative error. After he left, I sat down at my kitchen table, the letter before me like some artifact from another civilization. $3 million would change everything. I could quit my job at the struggling public high school where I taught. I could write that novel I'd been planning for years. I could travel. I could. My phone pinged with a text from Will. We're something professional tomorrow. Martin Donovan respects appearances. I sighed, the familiar weight settling back on my shoulders. Even with financial independence on the horizon, some things never changed. In my family, Will would always be in charge, and I would always be the one who needed guidance. But for the first time, I found myself wondering if that dynamic was about to shift. The offices of Donovan and Associates occupied the top floor of a sleek downtown building, all glass and polished steel. Will and I rode the elevator in silence, him checking emails on his phone, me trying to calm the nervous flutter in my stomach. Martin Donovan met us in the reception area. In his 70s, with a shock of white hair and keen blue eyes, he'd been my grandfather's lawyer for decades. William, Sarah, thank you for coming, he greeted us, shaking hands firmly. Please, follow me. His corner office offered a panoramic view of the city, with my grandfather's buildings prominently visible in the skyline. The Mitchell legacy, written in steel and concrete. I understand you have questions about Harold's will, Donovan began, settling behind his desk. Specifically, about Sarah's inheritance. It seems unusual, Will said immediately. My grandfather was meticulous about his estate planning. He reviewed everything with me before his passing, and there was no mention of a separate trust for Sarah. Donovan nodded, as if he'd anticipated this exact response. Harold was indeed meticulous. So meticulous, in fact, that he created this trust 20 years ago and instructed me to keep it completely confidential. Even from you, William. 20 years ago? I echoed, stunned. I would have been only 12. Correct, Donovan confirmed. Harold established this trust shortly after your grandmother's passing. Will leaned forward. That makes no sense. Why would he hide this from me? I was his chosen successor, his confidant. Something in Donovan's expression shifted, a flash of what might have been sympathy. Harold left specific instructions to be shared with both of you at this meeting. He opened a drawer and removed a sealed envelope. He asked that I read this aloud, with both of you present. I glanced at Will, who had gone completely still. Donovan broke the seal and began to read. To my grandchildren, William and Sarah. If you're hearing this, then 6 months have passed since my death, and William has accepted the terms of my primary will without contest, as I anticipated he would. William, you have received what you always wanted, control of Mitchell Enterprises, the family estate, and the majority of my fortune. You have been groomed for this role since childhood, and I have no doubt you will expand the business even further. Your ambition and determination are your greatest strengths, though perhaps also your greatest weaknesses. Sarah, you have received what you never expected, financial independence. While you may believe I overlooked you throughout your life, the truth is quite the opposite. I have always seen your quiet strength, your compassion, and your integrity. Qualities that reminded me so much of your grandmother that sometimes it was painful to acknowledge them. The reason for this separate trust is simple: balance. In our family, the scales have always tilted toward business, toward expansion, toward wealth accumulation. You, Sarah, represent something different, something I fear has been systematically devalued in the Mitchell family for generations. This money is yours, without conditions or expectations. Use it to live the life you choose, not the one chosen for you. William, I ask that you respect this decision, though I know it will be difficult for you to understand. Not everything of value can be listed on a balance sheet. To both of you, remember that true wealth lies not in what you possess, but in what possesses your heart. Harold James Mitchell. Silence filled the office as Donovan set down the letter. I felt tears pricking at my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. After a lifetime of feeling invisible to my grandfather, to discover he had seen me all along, had valued qualities in me that the rest of the family dismissed, was overwhelming. Will's face had gone rigid, his knuckles white where they gripped the armrest. There are some additional legal details to discuss, Donovan continued after a moment, his tone shifting back to professional. The trust is structured to provide both a lump sum and annual payments, with certain tax advantages. As he outlined the specifics, I tried to process what I'd just heard. My grandfather had created this trust when I was just a child, had seen something in me worth protecting even then. How had I never noticed? How had he hidden his regards so completely that I'd grown up believing I was a disappointment to him? And the papers just need your signature, Sarah, Donovan was saying, sliding documents across the desk toward me. Wait. Will's voice cut through my thoughts. I'd like our family lawyers to review these before Sarah signs anything. Donovan raised a white eyebrow. Of course. Though I should mention that your family lawyers are actually Mitchell Enterprises lawyers, not Sarah's. There might be a conflict of interest there. I'll sign them now, I said quietly. Will's head snapped toward me. Sarah, you can't just sign financial documents without proper review. That's exactly what grandfather meant about you having no head for business. Actually, I corrected him, reaching for the pen Donovan offered. Grandfather never said that in his letter. That's what you and Dad always said. For perhaps the first time in our adult lives, Will looked genuinely taken aback. Sarah. It's my inheritance, Will, I said, signing my name with a newfound confidence. I get to decide how to handle it. As we left Donovan's office 30 minutes later, the tension between us was palpable. In the elevator, Will finally broke the silence. I hope you realize what this means, he said, staring straight ahead at the descending floor numbers. This money changes things. Yes, I agreed. That's rather the point, isn't it? His jaw tightened. People will come after you, Sarah. Financial advisors, investment managers, charities, distant relatives suddenly remembering how much they adore you. You're not prepared for that world. Maybe not, I conceded. But I'll learn. And the family dinners, the holiday gatherings, it's going to be awkward now. I turned to look at him directly. Only if you make it awkward, Will. This doesn't have to change our relationship. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Doesn't it? Grandfather just told me, in writing, that I'm too ambitious and calculating. That your quiet strength is somehow more valuable than everything I've worked for my entire life. That's not what he said at all, I protested. He valued both of us, just differently. The elevator doors opened, and Will stepped out first, already pulling out his phone. I have meetings all afternoon. You can get yourself home? I nodded, watching as he strode across the lobby, already dialing a number. My brother, perpetually in motion, always moving on to the next task, the next acquisition, the next challenge. But for once, I wasn't an afterthought in his world. For better or worse, I had suddenly become a complication. And strangely, I didn't mind at all. My mother's reaction to the news was exactly as complex as I'd anticipated. $3 million, she repeated, her teacup frozen halfway to her lips. We sat in her sunroom, surrounded by the carefully curated luxury that defined her existence as a Mitchell. And Will knows about this? Yes, we met with Mr. Donovan together this morning. Her brow furrowed with concern. How did he take it? Of course that would be her first worry, Will's feelings, Will's reaction. It had always been this way. I searched for the right word. Processing. She set down her cup with a sigh. Your grandfather always did like to stir the pot, even from beyond the grave. She reached for my hand. I'm happy for you, darling. Truly. But be careful. Careful of what? Money changes things. Relationships, perceptions, expectations. She squeezed my fingers. Especially in this family. Will seems to think I can't handle it, I said, the familiar sting of his doubt rising again. My mother's expression softened. Your brother is protective, in his way. You've always been different from the rest of us. More like my mother, thoughtful, introspective. The Mitchells aren't known for those qualities. That's what grandfather said in his letter. That I reminded him of grandmother. A shadow crossed her face. Did he? Interesting. Mom? What does that mean? She stood, moving to adjust a perfectly arranged vase of flowers. Just that your grandfather and grandmother had a complicated relationship. More complicated than most people knew. I waited, sensing there was more she wasn't saying. Your grandmother was an artist, did you know that? She continued after a moment. Before she married into the Mitchell family. She painted beautiful landscapes. Had real talent. I never knew that, I said, surprised. My memories of my grandmother were hazy. She had died when I was 12, the same year my grandfather had secretly established the trust. Of course you didn't, my mother said. Because she gave it up. Harold didn't think it was suitable for his wife to dabble in hobbies when she could be helping him build his social connections. All those paintings were stored away. I don't even know if they still exist. I sat with this revelation, this glimpse into a grandmother I had barely known, whose artistic spirit had been suppressed by the very man who had now empowered me to follow my own path. I always thought grandfather was this straightforward, driven businessman, I said quietly. But now I'm discovering all these layers. My mother's laugh was tinged with sadness. Men like your grandfather are never simple, Sarah. They build empires by understanding exactly what makes people tick, their desires, their weaknesses, their potential. He saw all of us with those calculating eyes. She turned back to me. Including you. Then why did he never show it? Why did I grow up feeling like I was never good enough? Because that's how Mitchells operate, darling. They keep their cards close to their chest. Especially Harold. She sat beside me again. Have you decided what you'll do with the money? The abrupt change of subject was another Mitchell family specialty. Emotional excavation could only go so deep before it was time to return to practicalities. Not yet. I'm still processing everything. Well, don't rush. And, maybe don't tell your brother immediately, whatever you decide. She patted my knee. Give him time to adjust. As I drove home from my mother's house, her words echoed in my mind. The glimpse into my grandparents' relationship had shifted something in my understanding of the past, and possibly the present as well. My grandfather had seen me. Had valued me. Had given me the means to become my own person, outside the Mitchell empire that had consumed everyone else in its orbit. But at what cost to the family I still loved, despite our differences? My phone rang through the car's speaker system. Will. I need you to come to the office, he said without preamble. There's something we need to discuss. Hello to you too, I replied, an echo of yesterday's greeting. I'm actually on my way home from Mom's. This is important, Sarah. It's about grandfather's trust. My stomach tightened. What about it? I'd rather not discuss it over the phone. How soon can you be at Mitchell Tower? I checked the time. 20 minutes, I guess. Good. Come directly to my office. He hung up. The familiar Mitchell imperiousness, expecting everyone to rearrange their schedules at a moment's notice, grated more than usual. But curiosity won out over irritation. What could Will possibly have discovered about my inheritance in the few hours since our meeting with Donovan? Mitchell Tower dominated the downtown skyline, a gleaming monument to my family's success. As I rode the executive elevator to the top floor, I felt the familiar mixture of pride and alienation that always accompanied visits to the family business, a business that had never included a place for me. Will's executive assistant greeted me with a professional smile. Ms. Mitchell, your brother is expecting you. Go right in. Will's office was the corner suite that had once belonged to our grandfather, spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows and views of the city he now controlled. He stood at the window, his back to the door, phone pressed to his ear. I don't care what their forecasts show, he was saying. Mitchell Enterprises doesn't wait for permission. Proceed with the acquisition as planned. He ended the call and turned, acknowledging me with a nod. Sarah. Thank you for coming. You didn't give me much choice, I replied, taking a seat across from his desk. What's this about? Instead of sitting, Will opened a drawer and removed a thick folder. I've spent the afternoon researching grandfather's financial activities from 20 years ago, he said, placing the folder before me. The year he established your trust. Why? Because the timing bothered me. He finally sat, his posture perfect as always. 20 years ago, Mitchell Enterprises was in the middle of its biggest expansion. The Carson Building, the riverfront development, the merger with Westfield Industries, all happening simultaneously. I wasn't sure where this was going. Okay, and? And, Will continued, it was also the year grandfather pushed through the South Side redevelopment project. The one that involved demolishing that old arts district to build luxury condos. A vague memory stirred, newspaper headlines, protests, something about historical preservation. I'd been too young to pay much attention at the time. What does this have to do with my inheritance? Will leaned forward. The South Side project faced massive resistance from local artists and community groups. One of the loudest opponents was a woman named Eleanor Hayes. The name meant nothing to me. I don't understand. Eleanor Hayes was a painter. And she was also our grandmother's closest friend. I stared at him, the pieces slowly clicking into place. Mom just told me grandmother was an artist. Yes, Will confirmed. Before she married into the Mitchell family. She gave it up, but apparently remained connected to the arts community. Including Hayes. So grandmother opposed the South Side project? I was trying to follow his reasoning. Will's expression was grim. Not publicly. But according to these records, there were significant tensions in their marriage during that period. And then, suddenly, grandfather established this secret trust for you, the granddaughter who reminded him of his wife. You think it was, what? Guilt money? I think, Will said carefully, that grandfather made choices he later regretted. I think the trust was his way of compensating for decisions that hurt people he cared about. Including, possibly, our grandmother. I sat back, processing this new information. Even if that's true, what does it matter now? He's gone. The trust exists. It matters, Will replied, his voice hardening slightly, because Mitchell Enterprises is still living with the consequences of those decisions. The South Side project made us millions, but it also branded us as heartless corporate raiders willing to destroy cultural heritage for profit. A reputation I've been working to change. Ah. Now the real reason for this conversation emerged. And my unexpected inheritance complicates that, I finished for him. Will didn't deny it. If word gets out that Harold Mitchell secretly set aside millions for his artistic granddaughter right after bulldozing an arts district, people will make connections. Not flattering ones. So what are you suggesting? I asked, though I already suspected his answer. I think we need to be strategic about how this inheritance is presented to the public, he said smoothly. Perhaps as a joint philanthropic initiative. The Mitchell Family Foundation has an excellent reputation for cultural support. Your inheritance could be channeled through. No, I interrupted, surprising both of us. That's not what grandfather wanted. Will's eyebrows rose. Sarah. He specifically said the money was mine without conditions or expectations. That I should use it to live the life I choose, not the one chosen for me. I understand that, but... Do you? I stood up, a surge of clarity washing through me. This has nothing to do with public perception, Will. This is about control. You can't stand that there's a piece of the Mitchell fortune that you don't have authority over. His expression confirmed my accusation more clearly than any denial. This isn't just about you, Sarah, he said, his voice tightly controlled. It's about our family legacy. Everything grandfather built, everything I'm continuing to build. Your decisions affect all of us now. Maybe that's exactly what grandfather wanted, I replied, gathering my purse. Maybe he was tired of the Mitchell legacy steamrolling over people's lives. Maybe he wanted to ensure that at least one part of his fortune would be used for something besides making more money. Will's jaw tightened. You have no idea what you're talking about. Running a company like Mitchell Enterprises requires difficult decisions. Yes, I'm sure bulldozing an arts district was very difficult for grandfather, I said, my voice dripping with uncharacteristic sarcasm. Especially while his wife watched her friends lose their livelihoods. That's not fair. Isn't it? I moved toward the door. Thanks for the history lesson, Will. It's actually been quite illuminating. As I reached for the handle, his voice stopped me. If you walk away from this conversation, Sarah, you're walking away from the family. From everything we stand for. I turned back. What exactly do we stand for, Will? Because I'm starting to think grandfather wasn't so sure anymore. The look on my brother's face, shock mingled with something that might have been fear, stayed with me as I left the Mitchell Tower, feeling lighter than I had in years. The next morning, I called the school and requested a personal day, something I rarely did. Then I drove to the city archives, determined to learn more about the South Side redevelopment project and Eleanor Hayes. The archivist, an older woman named Patricia, was remarkably helpful once I explained what I was looking for. The South Side Arts District, she mused, pulling up records on her computer. That was quite the controversy back in the day. Let me see what we have. She disappeared into the stacks, returning with several boxes of newspapers, photographs, and public records. Here's the initial proposal, she said, handing me a thick document. And these are the community responses, including petitions and protest documentation. I spent hours sifting through the materials, piecing together a story I'd been too young to understand at the time. The South Side District had been a thriving creative community, galleries, studios, small theaters, cafes. The buildings were old but historically significant. The residents had fought hard to save their neighborhood from Mitchell Enterprises' wrecking balls. And there, in a black and white photograph of a protest, I saw her, Eleanor Hayes, standing at the front of the crowd, holding a sign that read Art Matters. Next to her, partially hidden by another protester but unmistakable, was my grandmother. My breath caught. The official family narrative had always portrayed my grandmother as the perfect corporate wife, elegant, supportive, focused on charity work and social connections. But here she was, secretly supporting a cause that directly opposed her husband's business interests. Find what you were looking for? Patricia asked, noting my reaction to the photograph. I think so, I said softly. Do you have any information on Eleanor Hayes specifically? Patricia's eyes lit up. Oh yes, Eleanor was quite well known in those days. Talented painter, community organizer. She had a gallery on Wright Street before the redevelopment. She disappeared again, returning with a slim folder. Here's a feature article about her from the City magazine, after the district was demolished. The article included several photographs: Eleanor in her studio, Eleanor with community members, and one striking image of Eleanor with my grandmother, both women smiling, arms linked. The caption read, Eleanor Hayes with longtime friend and patron Margaret Mitchell at Hayes' final gallery showing. Patron? My grandmother had been supporting Eleanor's work? The article confirmed it. Among Hayes' most steadfast supporters was Margaret Mitchell, wife of developer Harold Mitchell, the very man whose company would eventually force Hayes from her studio. While Mrs. Mitchell declined to comment publicly on the apparent conflict, sources close to the artist confirm that the women's friendship remained intact, despite being conducted with increasing discretion. The pieces were falling into place: my grandmother's secret support for the arts, her friendship with Eleanor, the tension in my grandparents' marriage, and ultimately, my grandfather's establishment of the trust fund in the year following these events. But one question remained unanswered: why me? Why had my grandfather chosen me, specifically, as the recipient of this apparent atonement. As I gathered my things to leave, Patricia handed me one final document. "I think you might find this interesting as well," she said. "It's from several years after the redevelopment, when they dedicated the new community center on the north side." The document was a program from a dedication ceremony. Listed among the benefactors was the Mitchell Family Foundation, specifically, a new arts initiative established in Margaret Mitchell's name after her death. "My grandfather created an arts program for her," I murmured. Patricia nodded. "Quite a generous one, actually. Scholarships, studio spaces, exhibition opportunities. It was seen as quite a turnaround for Mitchell Enterprises, which had previously been viewed as hostile to the arts community." "And it happened after she died," I said, more to myself than Patricia. "After it was too late to make it up to her directly." I left the archives with a much clearer picture of my family's complicated history, and my place within it. My grandmother, the secret artist and patron. My grandfather, the businessman who regretted the pain he'd caused her. And me, apparently the inheritor of my grandmother's artistic sensibility, chosen to receive the resources she had been denied. That evening, I sat at my small desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper. I hadn't attempted to draw or paint since high school, when my father had gently but firmly steered me toward more practical pursuits. The Mitchell way. But tonight, something compelled me to pick up a pencil. To try. The first lines were hesitant, uncertain. But as minutes turned to hours, an image emerged, the South Side district as it had appeared in the old photographs, vibrant with life and creativity. It wasn't good, not by any objective standard. But it felt right. When my phone rang past midnight, I was surprised to see my mother's name on the screen. "Mom? Is everything okay?" "I just got off the phone with your brother," she said, her voice tight with concern. "He's quite upset, Sarah." "Something about you walking out of a meeting? About the inheritance?" I sighed, setting down my pencil. "It wasn't a meeting, Mom. It was an ambush. Will tried to convince me to put my inheritance into the family foundation so he could control it. He said he was concerned about public perception, given the timing of the trust's creation." "Yes, I'm sure that's how he framed it," I replied, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "Did he mention that grandfather established the trust right after demolishing the arts district where grandmother's friend Eleanor Hayes had her gallery?" A long silence followed. "He mentioned the connection, yes." "Did you know, Mom? About grandmother's involvement with the arts community? About her friendship with Eleanor?" Another pause. "Yes," she finally admitted. "It wasn't something we discussed openly, but, yes. Your grandmother had a complicated life." "Because grandfather made it complicated," I said. "He suppressed her artistic side, and then crushed her friend's business. No wonder there was tension in their marriage." "It wasn't that simple, Sarah," my mother replied, a defensive note entering her voice. "Your grandfather provided an incredible life for his family. He built something remarkable. At what cost, though? And if he was so proud of his accomplishments, why did he secretly set aside millions for me right after the South Side project?" "It feels like guilt money, Mom." "Perhaps it was," she conceded. "Or perhaps it was recognition. Harold could be ruthless in business, but he wasn't blind. He saw what the Mitchell drive for success cost Margaret. And later, he saw the same artistic spirit in you. And let me guess, he saw Dad and was steering me away from it, just like he had done to grandmother." My mother's sigh was heavy with old regrets. "The Mitchell men have strong ideas about practical careers, yes. But Sarah, whatever your grandfather's motives, the trust exists. The question is, what will you do with it? It was the same question I'd been asking myself since the letter arrived. What would I do with this unexpected freedom? This chance to live unconstrained by the Mitchell expectations for the first time in my life? I don't know yet, I answered honestly. But I think I need to learn more about grandmother. About who she was beyond the perfect Mitchell wife. That may be difficult, my mother warned. Harold was thorough in shaping the family narrative. But you knew her, I pressed. You could tell me about her. To a point, she agreed. But there was someone who knew her better. Someone who might still be alive. Eleanor Hayes? My pulse quickened. Yes. Last I heard, she had relocated to a small town outside the city. She'd be quite elderly now, but... Can you find out for sure? If she's still alive? Where she is? I could practically hear my mother's reluctance through the phone. Your brother wouldn't approve of this line of inquiry, Sarah. I'm not asking for Will's permission, Mom. I'm asking for your help. Another silence, longer this time. Then, I'll see what I can find out. But Sarah, be careful. The past doesn't always provide the answers we hope for. After we hung up, I returned to my drawing, now seeing it with new eyes. The Mitchell legacy wasn't just the gleaming towers that dominated the city skyline. It was also the creative community that had been sacrificed to build them. It was my grandmother's suppressed artistic talent. It was my grandfather's late-in-life regret. And now, it was my unexpected inheritance, and the freedom to choose what kind of Mitchell I wanted to be. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had options beyond the narrow path that had been laid out for me. Beyond the Mitchell way. And despite the family complications it would undoubtedly cause, I couldn't wait to explore them. 2 days later, my mother called with an address. Eleanor Hayes, she said without preamble. She's living in Cedar Grove, about an hour outside the city. In a retirement community called Sunset Gardens. My heart leapt. She's alive? You're sure? Very much so, my mother confirmed. In fact, I spoke with her this morning. You what? I called the facility and asked to speak with her. I thought it best to prepare her for your potential visit. She remembered me, surprisingly. I sat down, trying to process this. What did she say? Did you tell her about the inheritance? No, nothing specific. Just that Margaret's granddaughter was interested in learning more about her grandmother's connection to the arts. She seemed receptive to the idea of meeting you. Thank you, Mom, I said, genuinely touched by her effort. This means a lot. Sarah. Her voice took on a cautionary tone. Will called again. He's concerned about the direction you're taking with this inheritance. He mentioned something about a family emergency meeting. I rolled my eyes, though she couldn't see it. Of course he did. He's only trying to protect the family name. He's trying to protect his control over the family narrative, I corrected her. There's a difference. My mother sighed. Perhaps. But be prepared for resistance, Sarah. The Mitchells don't adapt easily to change. After she hung up, I sat for a long moment, considering my options. Will would undoubtedly escalate his efforts to bring me into line. The family emergency meeting would be designed to pressure me into compliance, using our mother, possibly even our father on a video call from his retirement in Arizona, to make me see reason. But for once, I didn't feel the familiar pull to appease my family. Instead, I opened my laptop and booked a visit to Sunset Gardens for the following morning. The retirement community was nestled among rolling hills, its buildings designed to blend with the natural surroundings. As I checked in at the reception desk, my heart pounded with anticipation and nervousness. "Ms. Hayes is expecting you," the receptionist said with a smile. "She's in the sunroom, through those doors and to the left." I found Eleanor Hayes sitting near a large window, a sketchbook balanced on her lap. At first glance, she looked like any other elderly resident, white hair cut in a practical bob, comfortable clothes, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. But as I drew closer, I noticed her hands, still steady, marked with the faint stains of someone who worked regularly with paint and charcoal. She looked up as I approached, her gaze sharp and assessing. "You must be Sarah," she said, her voice stronger than I'd expected. "Margaret's granddaughter." "Yes," I confirmed, suddenly shy. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." She gestured to the chair across from her. "I admit, I was surprised by your mother's call. The Mitchells aren't usually interested in old history." "I think that's changing," I said, settling into the seat. "At least for me." Eleanor studied me, her artist's eye taking in details I could only guess at. "You have her smile," she said finally. "Margaret's. Though I imagine no one's ever told you that." "No," I admitted. "I'm usually told I take after my father's side." She nodded, as if this confirmed something for her. The Mitchells are good at seeing what they want to see. And not seeing what they don't. She closed her sketchbook. "Your mother said you were interested in Margaret's artistic side." "Yes." I took a deep breath. I recently learned that my grandmother was an artist before she married into the Mitchell family. "And that you were her close friend." "More than a friend," Eleanor corrected gently. "She was my greatest patron. And my greatest loss." "I also learned about the South Side redevelopment," I continued. "About your gallery." Eleanor's eyes darkened with old pain. "Ah. So that's what this is about. Mitchell Enterprises rewriting history again?" "No," I said quickly. "It's more personal than that. My grandfather left me an inheritance. A significant one. And I believe it might be connected to what happened with the South Side project." I explained about the trust, established the year after the redevelopment, and my grandfather's letter indicating that I reminded him of my grandmother. As I spoke, Eleanor's expression shifted from skepticism to thoughtful consideration. "Harold Mitchell with a guilty conscience," she mused when I finished. "Now that's something I never thought I'd hear." "Was he really that ruthless?" I asked. Eleanor looked out the window, considering her answer. "Harold was singular in his focus. Mitchell Enterprises was everything. Anyone who got in the way was simply an obstacle to be removed." She turned back to me. "Including his wife's happiness, if necessary." "What was she like?" "My grandmother. The real Margaret, not the Mitchell family version." A genuine smile spread across Eleanor's face. "She was extraordinary. Talented, passionate about art, deeply sensitive to beauty in all its forms. Her landscapes captured something most painters miss, the emotion of a place, not just its appearance." She leaned forward. "She was also stubborn, fiercely loyal, and braver than anyone knew." "Brave?" Eleanor nodded. "It took courage to maintain her friendship with me after Harold made his plans for Southside clear. She couldn't oppose him publicly, that wasn't done in Mitchell marriages, but she found ways to help. Anonymous donations to our legal fund. Connections with journalists who covered our protests. And after the demolition. She paused, emotion briefly overtaking her. After the demolition, she established a private grant that helped many displaced artists relocate and restart. Harold never knew. At least, we thought he never knew. I absorbed this, trying to reconcile this version of my grandmother with the proper, reserved woman I vaguely remembered. But if she was so passionate about art, why did she give it up completely when she married grandfather? Eleanor's laugh held a note of bitterness. She didn't, not really. She just became more discreet. Margaret kept a small studio in the caretaker's cottage on the Mitchell estate. That's where she painted, where we sometimes met. There was a studio on the estate? But I never heard about it. I expect it was cleared out after her death, Eleanor replied. Harold wouldn't have wanted reminders of that part of her life. I thought about the timing, my grandmother's death, followed by my grandfather establishing the trust for me, his artistic granddaughter. Did he know? I asked softly. About the studio? About her continuing to paint? Eleanor considered this. I always assumed he didn't. Margaret was careful. But Harold had ways of discovering things he wasn't meant to know. She fixed me with a penetrating gaze. Which brings us back to your inheritance. You believe it's connected to what happened between Harold and Margaret? I think. I hesitated, organizing my thoughts. I think grandfather regretted something. Maybe suppressing grandmother's art. Maybe the South Side project. Maybe both. And I think when he saw the same artistic inclinations in me, he wanted to ensure I wouldn't face the same limitations. Eleanor nodded slowly. It's possible. People do change, even hard men like Harold Mitchell. She reopened her sketchbook, flipping through until she found what she was looking for. I've kept this all these years. Perhaps it's time it had a new caretaker. She carefully removed a page and handed it to me. It was a portrait, my grandmother, much younger than I'd ever known her, sitting at an easel, her face alive with concentration and joy. Margaret at 30, Eleanor explained. In the studio at the caretaker's cottage. I drew this the summer before the South Side project was announced. Before everything changed. I stared at the image, transfixed by this glimpse of my grandmother's hidden life. Thank you, I whispered, handling the sketch reverently. This is priceless. There's more, Eleanor said. If you're interested. I kept some of her paintings after she died. Harold wanted everything packed away, but Margaret had entrusted several pieces to me for safekeeping. I'd like you to have them. My eyes widened. You've actually got her work? Her paintings? 5 of them. Not her largest or most elaborate, those were too difficult to move discreetly. But some of her best, I think. She smiled at my expression. They should belong to someone who understands their true value. Someone who might share Margaret's gift. I don't know what to say. Say you'll use that inheritance to honor who you are, Eleanor replied. Not who the Mitchells think you should be. She patted my hand. Margaret would have liked that. As I drove back to the city, Eleanor's words and the portrait of my grandmother resting carefully on the passenger seat, I felt as though some missing piece of myself had finally clicked into place. I wasn't just a Mitchell who didn't quite fit. I was Margaret's granddaughter, heir to a legacy of quiet courage and artistic passion that had survived despite powerful opposition. By the time I reached my home, I had made my decision. The Mitchell family emergency meeting was set for Saturday morning at my mother's house. As expected, Will had marshaled the full force of family pressure, our mother, our father on video call from Arizona, even our Uncle Lawrence, who served on the Mitchell Enterprises board. Sarah, will begin once everyone was settled in the formal living room. We've asked you here because we're concerned about the direction you seem to be taking with grandfather's trust. I sat calmly, the confidence I'd gained from my visit with Eleanor carrying me through what would once have been an intimidating gathering. What direction is that, exactly? I asked. Will glanced at our father's face on the tablet screen. Dad, would you like to start? Our father, tanned from his desert retirement, frowned. Sarah, we understand you've been investigating old Mitchell Enterprises projects. The South Side development, specifically. Yes, I confirmed. I've been learning about our family history. Some aspects of history are better left in the past, Uncle Lawrence interjected. Especially when they involve sensitive business decisions. You mean like demolishing an arts district where grandmother's close friend had her gallery? I asked innocently. The uncomfortable glances between the Mitchell men confirmed that this was precisely what they meant. Business requires difficult choices, my father said, using almost the same words Will had. Your grandfather built an empire that has provided for this entire family. Including you. I'm well aware of what grandfather built, I replied. And what was sacrificed to build it. Will leaned forward, his patience visibly wearing thin. The point is, Sarah, that your inheritance comes with responsibilities. To the family name. To the company's reputation. Actually, I countered, grandfather specifically said it came with no conditions or expectations. Those were his exact words. He couldn't have anticipated you using it to dredge up controversies from the past, Will argued. Or potentially associating the Mitchell name with questionable causes. What questionable causes? My mother asked, speaking for the first time. Will hesitated. Sarah has been spending time with Eleanor Hayes. A woman who was openly hostile to Mitchell Enterprises and grandfather's vision for the city. I visited her once, I corrected. To learn about grandmother. And what I discovered was illuminating. I turned to our mother. Did you know grandmother kept a secret painting studio in the caretaker's cottage? That she continued making art her entire life, even though grandfather disapproved? My mother's surprise seemed genuine. No, I had no idea. Of course not, I said gently. Because the Mitchell family only preserves the parts of history that fit the narrative. The successful businessman and his perfect, supportive wife. Not the artist who had to hide her passion. Not the woman who secretly helped the friends her husband's business displaced. This is exactly the problem, Will interrupted. This, revisionist history that makes grandfather seem like some sort of villain. I don't think he was a villain, I said. I think he was a complicated man who, toward the end of his life, recognized the cost of some of his choices. And wanted to make amends in the only way he knew how. I opened my bag and carefully removed the portrait Eleanor had given me, passing it to my mother. This is grandmother at 30. In her secret studio. My mother's hand trembled slightly as she took the drawing. This is. I never knew. Eleanor Hayes drew this, I explained. She also kept several of grandmother's paintings. Preserved them after her death, when grandfather wanted them all packed away and forgotten. As the portrait was passed around, even Uncle Lawrence looking startled by this tangible evidence of a Margaret Mitchell none of them had known, I continued. I've made my decision about the inheritance, I announced. I'm establishing the Margaret Mitchell Arts Foundation. To provide grants, studio space, and exhibition opportunities for artists in the city. With special emphasis on the South Side community. Sarah, Will warned. You need to think about how this will look. I have thought about it, I replied. I think it will look like the Mitchell family finally acknowledging all aspects of its legacy, not just the profitable ones. This is exactly what we were concerned about, Uncle Lawrence muttered. No, I corrected him. You were concerned about control. About maintaining the carefully cultivated Mitchell image. But grandfather gave me this money for a reason. He wanted something different for his legacy. Something more than just more buildings, more profits. I turned to Will. You inherited the empire, the power, the Mitchell drive for success. But I inherited something too, grandmother's artistic spirit. Her quiet courage. And I intend to honor that legacy just as seriously as you honor grandfather's business achievements. Will stared at me, clearly unused to this level of resistance. The board won't like this. The board has no say in how I use my inheritance, I reminded him. And if they're concerned about the Mitchell reputation, perhaps they should consider how a charitable foundation honoring the family's artistic legacy might actually enhance it. My father cleared his throat. Sarah has a point, Will. The Margaret Mitchell Arts Foundation could be a positive addition to the family's philanthropic profile. Especially if it's positioned correctly. Always the pragmatist, even in retirement. I'm not doing this for the Mitchell brand, I said firmly. I'm doing it because it's right. Because it honors both grandmother's passion and grandfather's apparent late-in-life regret about suppressing it. I stood, gathering my things. The foundation will proceed with or without the family's blessing. But I would hope that after 20 years, we might finally acknowledge all of who Margaret Mitchell was, not just the parts that fit neatly into the Mitchell success story. My mother's hand closed around the portrait of her mother-in-law. I would like to help, she said quietly. If you'll let me. Will's eyes widened at this unexpected defection. I'd like that, I told her, surprised but touched. As I left the family meeting, I felt the weight of expectations I'd carried my entire life, finally lifting. For the first time, I wasn't the disappointing Mitchell, the one who didn't quite measure up to the family standards of success. I was forging my own path, one my grandmother had been denied until it was too late. 1 month later, I stood in the newly leased space that would become the headquarters of the Margaret Mitchell Arts Foundation. The building, fittingly, was located on the edge of what had once been the South Side Arts District, a deliberate choice that hadn't gone unnoticed by the local press. Mitchell heiress brings arts back to South Side, the headline had read, much to Will's dismay. But even he had begun to adapt, especially after the Mitchell Enterprises PR team reported overwhelmingly positive public response to the foundation's announcement. You know, Eleanor said, surveying the space beside me, Margaret would have loved this. I had invited her to serve as the foundation's honorary chairperson, a role she had accepted with unexpected emotion. The 5 paintings she had preserved, my grandmother's hidden legacy, would form the centerpiece of our first exhibition. I still can't believe they were stored in your attic all these years, I said, glancing at the carefully wrapped canvases waiting to be hung. Where else would they be safe from the Mitchell penchant for rewriting history, she replied with a wry smile. Though I must say, you're creating quite the new chapter yourself. She wasn't wrong. The foundation had already received applications from dozens of local artists seeking grants and studio space. And more surprisingly, tentative support from unexpected corners of my family. My mother had indeed joined the board. My father had made a modest contribution. Even Uncle Lawrence had grudgingly admitted that the initiative might add dimension to the Mitchell legacy. Only Will remained skeptical, though he had ceased his active opposition after the positive press coverage. Just make sure it's run properly, had been his final comment on the matter. You're a Mitchell, after all. As Eleanor and I discussed the upcoming opening reception, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Found something in the attic at the old house. I think you should see it. Intrigued, I made my way to the Mitchell family estate after leaving the foundation space. My mother met me at the door, holding a dusty leather portfolio. The caretaker's cottage was demolished years ago, she explained, leading me to the sunroom. But apparently, not everything was discarded. This was in a trunk with some of Margaret's old belongings. She carefully opened the portfolio to reveal sketches, notes, and watercolor studies, my grandmother's artistic process captured in delicate, yellowing pages. There's something else, my mother said, removing an envelope tucked into the portfolio's inner pocket. It's addressed to Harold. The letter, dated just weeks before my grandmother's death, was never sent. In it, Margaret Mitchell had written a final plea to her husband. Harold. As my time grows short, I find myself reflecting on our life together. On what we've built, and what we've sacrificed. I've never reproached you for insisting I set aside my painting when we married. It was a different time, and we both understood the expectations placed on a Mitchell wife. But the South Side was different. Eleanor and the others weren't just pursuing hobbies, they were professional artists whose livelihoods you destroyed. My silence then remains my greatest regret. I ask only this: when I am gone, look for the beauty in the world, not just the profit. Perhaps in our grandchildren, you might see qualities worth nurturing beyond the Mitchell ambition for expansion and acquisition. Our little Sarah, especially, seems to have an artist's soul. Don't let it be crushed as mine nearly was. With enduring love despite everything. Margaret. As I finished reading, tears blurred my vision. She saw it in me even then. When I was just a child. My mother squeezed my hand. She did. And apparently, so did Harold, eventually. The letter explained everything: my grandfather's secret trust, established after my grandmother's death. His specific instructions that it be used to live the life you choose, not the one chosen for you. His recognition of my grandmother's qualities in me. He had read her unsent letter after her death. And in his own way, with the tools he understood, money, legal structures, careful planning, he had tried to honor her final request. 6 months after the Margaret Mitchell Arts Foundation opened its doors, I stood before an audience at our first major exhibition opening. 5 landscapes by Margaret Mitchell hung on the wall behind me, finally displayed publicly after decades in hiding. Beside them, works by artists who had received the foundation's inaugural grants, including several from the South Side community. Eleanor sat in the front row, her eyes bright with unshed tears as I began my speech. The Mitchell name has long been associated with this city's skyline, I said, glancing at Will, who stood stiffly at the back of the room. With buildings, development, economic growth. And that legacy is important. But tonight, we celebrate another Mitchell legacy, one of creativity, beauty, and artistic vision. I gestured to the paintings behind me. My grandmother, Margaret Mitchell, created these works in secret, because her passion for art didn't fit neatly into the role she was expected to play. Through this foundation, we ensure that today's artists don't face the same limitations, that their voices are heard, their work seen, their contributions valued. As applause filled the gallery, I caught sight of Eleanor Hayes nodding in quiet approval. Beside her, my mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Even Will seemed affected, though he would likely never admit it. Through the windows, the Mitchell Tower was visible against the night sky, a testament to my grandfather's vision and ambition. But here, in this converted warehouse filled with art and artists, my grandmother's vision lived on as well. Both legacies, finally acknowledged. Both valuable in their own way. As I mingled with guests after the speech, a young woman approached me hesitantly. "Ms. Mitchell? I just wanted to thank you. Your foundation's grant is helping me finish my degree in art therapy. I grew up in Southside before it changed. This feels like coming full circle." I smiled, thinking of my grandmother's secret studio, of Eleanor's preserved paintings, of my grandfather's belated attempt at making things right. "Sometimes circles take decades to complete," I told her. "But they do complete, eventually." "Will found me later," as the crowd began to thin. "Nice speech," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Thank you for coming," I replied, equally careful. "I wasn't sure you would." He shrugged. "We're still family. Despite everything." I studied my brother, seeing him perhaps more clearly than I ever had before. The pressure he'd always been under to be the perfect Mitchell son. The weight of legacy he carried alone for so long. "We are family," I agreed. "And maybe that can mean something different now. Something more balanced." Will glanced at our grandmother's paintings. "She was talented," he admitted. "I had no idea." "There's a lot about our family history we never knew," I said. "Maybe it's time we started looking at the complete picture, not just the parts that fit the official narrative." He smiled slightly, the closest Will ever came to admitting someone else might be right. "The foundation is good work, Sarah," he said finally. "Grandfather would approve." "Eventually." I laughed, knowing this was true. Harold Mitchell would have resisted, calculated, weighed the costs and benefits. But eventually, he would have seen the value in preserving both sides of the Mitchell legacy. As Will left, I found myself alone in the gallery, surrounded by my grandmother's landscapes and the works they had inspired in a new generation of artists. The trust fund that had started as my grandfather's attempt at atonement had become something more, a bridge between past and present, between different visions of what success could mean. I walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline my family had helped shape. The Mitchell Tower stood proud and tall against the night sky. But here, in this reclaimed space on the edge of what had once been the South Side Arts District, another kind of Mitchell legacy was taking root. Balanced, as my grandfather's letter had suggested. Different, but equally valuable. Margaret's artistic soul, honored at last. And mine, finally free to follow its own path. The circle was complete.